Let's talk, if we can, about something. It's something we've touched on in previous episodes about addressing root causes, right? And we use the example of lead poisoning and its connection to violent crime. And part of what you would like to see policing do is to address, the root cause of, how do we make sure we're not simply punishing people who are acting out because of something they can't control, and, somehow working to improve lead abatement or whatever it is, however it is that police would end up addressing that situation. But we've talked a bit about the fact that American law enforcement is really informed by this paradigm of punishing the perpetrator of the perceived crime. But in the example of someone who has committed a violent crime because, they may have been suffering the effects of lead exposure as a child, there is nonetheless a victim in that situation. And so, how, in thinking about using police to address root causes, do we reconcile our feelings about how we address the fact that a person has been victimized, and for that person saying, look, sorry that person tried to stab you or whatever it was, but for structural reasons, that's why that happened. And so the person's not really responsible. I mean, how do you balance that, you think, in a paradigm like this?
So, it's obviously a fair question. And we have to, we're still going to have people that rob banks, and we still are going to have to prosecute cases, and they're still going to end up going into the criminal justice system as part of what we do, as at least for inevitable in the foreseeable future. But when we change what we're trying to go after, then we're changing the idea of the department. But what happens in corrections is different, and I can't control that other than to be a bully pulpit to try and fight for a different perspective to that as well. So if we punish that individual, what retribution or reconciliation or whatever does that provide for the actual victim? That doesn't do anything, right? So if we even put that person and we put the death penalty on them, and the lady who got raped, there's nothing you get back. There was nothing there. There was no reparation whatsoever. So if we can think about that criminal justice system as being a tool of restorative justice for the victim instead of a tool of punishment for the offender, then I think we're actually serving the victim much better. And how I want to see that is, so I've said that, look, even if you want to confine somebody because they're a threat to society and you want to confine them for the rest of their life, then maybe we have to do that in certain circumstances. But if we do that as a punishment for that person, then we as a society don't get anything out of that, and we've invested a lot into it. But if we can think about that person who was the perpetrator, going into a prison where they're doing something productive, they're learning a skill, if you can send them to free school and they can get a PhD and eventually they're on good behavior and they're set to go out back into society and they can become a valuable to contributor to society, and maybe then 15% of their salary for the rest of their life goes to the victim, or and then you're actually providing some kind of means to restore justice and to make amends instead of just saying, I'm sorry you were victimized, but we kicked his ass, because that doesn't provide anything.
I mean, I'm curious whether we can really effectively focus on root causes to the extent that we still demand some version of quote unquote justice. I mean, will that word inevitably sort of bend us back into a punitive state? Because it has always been one of those things that felt to me like an outright false premise. Because for exactly the reason you said, right? Like, if somebody kills me and then the police arrest that person and they send them to jail, that doesn't bring me back to life, right? Like, my family doesn't get to spend the next 10 holidays with me now because the police did that. And so the idea of justice as sort of, balance, as sort of fixing the wrong, righting the wrong, quote unquote, would seem to demand oftentimes that we do the only thing we can do, right? Because there's no way to unkill somebody, right? There's no way to unassault somebody. So you simply have to punish. As long as we're still focused on this idea of justice, can we move adequately in the direction of root causes?
Well, I mean, if we're looking at justice as being defined that way, and I don't think it was originally designed that way, and the textbook definitions wouldn't be that way. Really, justice is about equality of treatment. So, like, one of the reason why people feel there's no justice in police killing is that when a police officer kills somebody, the system doesn't treat them the same. So people actually view justice just fine and value it regardless of how bad it is, as long as it is equal for everyone. So, like, people will see it as justice as long as all the rapists are treated that same way. And if the cop rapes, then they're treated that way. And if a lawyer rapes, they're treated that way. And if a rich guy on Wall Street rapes, he's treated that way. That's actually what justice is. It's more synonymous with equality than anything else.
Another issue that I think our conversation today has raised is the question of whether or not it is valid to think of somebody as a quote unquote criminal. And this is something that I wrestle a lot with. My instinct is to say that, there's no such thing as a criminal, right? There might be people who have violated statutes laid down by legislators, but to suggest that this somehow defines that person seems silly. Like, the idea that violating what is inevitably an arbitrary rule simply because of the human process that established it, whether or not we agree with that rule. The idea that you can sort of label somebody's person as a result of a violation of such a construct seems odd to me. But at the same time, I have to acknowledge that, in my own work, I have encountered those people who, frankly, have done terrible things and seem quite comfortable with the fact that they have done terrible things. And, I don't know what your experience of that particular issue was as a police officer. And I would say that that's not a common experience that I have. And even most of the times when I encounter something like that, is usually someone who's just, frankly, just immature. Like, they're still usually in their teenage years or something like that. And I know in a few years, they're probably going to think differently based on my conversations with other people. But do we have to, as a society, move away from the idea that some people are criminals in that way?
Well, I mean, so there's a reoccurring theme here of, like, what words actually mean versus how we are accepting them to mean. So we do say something like criminal, which I agree with you completely, is preposterous, because the difference, it doesn't actually mean criminal. What they're actually saying is person who went into the system and was processed, because the difference isn't whether they actually committed the criminal act, it's whether they got caught committing the criminal act. Because if it's definitely by criminal acts, well, then I'm a criminal too. I've done plenty of criminal things. I think everybody has in some way, shape, or form. We've over-criminalized society to the point that nobody can go without committing criminal offenses. It's a matter of who gets caught, and that's often a matter of who gets looked at. So generally, you're actually talking about a person who is victim of a system who is full of implicit biases and focuses an over-criminalized thing that anyone can be victim to. It's just that's who we look at. That's actually what you're saying. You're actually pointing out the fact that they're a victim to a biased system that we've created.
I mean, would you say that's true of all offenders, or is that more specifically true of, say, offenders of color, especially in urban environments?
Well, I think so obviously from an anecdotal account, and everything with human beings is never solid. And whenever human beings are involved, take anything that's 100% and throw it out the window. Yeah. You're always going to have exceptions to the rule, and there's going to be a lot of exceptions to every rule when human beings are involved. But even then, you're still talking about, unless you're talking about psychopaths, and that's usually a mental issue. That's not necessarily a societal cause that we can address anyway, so you wouldn't be able to deal with that. But for the things that we can control, like robberies, come from a reason.
Yeah.
And whatever that reason is a condition that we have set up as a society that we all have some level of responsibility for. That's why I try to say, like, how it's different in the Marine Corps, that everything that of a mission goal that failed is viewed as a failure. And so that would mean if your goal was to get into a situation and rescue a hostage, and that meant you wanted to catch all the terrorists involved too and not kill any of them, if you killed any of them, that would be viewed as a failure, and you would want to figure out how next time you didn't kill them so you would get their information and could do it better. So we have to continue to do that kind of thing when it comes to any case. No matter what it is with that robbery, it's going to come back to something that we're responsible for as a whole because we didn't apply those types of checks and balances to our society, and that neglect is our collective responsibility.
I'm curious. We've talked a little bit about, this practice in the military of debriefing afterwards and sort of figuring out if something went wrong, how do we prevent that in the future? And we often, in the sort of pop culture landscape, I think we have this perception that the worst thing about being a police officer is when you get to the end of your shift and you have to do all this paperwork. But it would also see, if that is the case, it seems like there are times built into the shift where you might be able to do some of this sort of debriefing thing. Like, is there a way to make a simple reform within policing to actually have a practice like this implemented? Or does this have to be a sort of more fundamental restructuring, a part of a more fundamental restructuring?
Yeah, I mean, you would have to think of it being as more of a part of a fundamental restructuring because, like, the very scheduling of patrol officers doesn't allow for that. So you would need some sort of overlapping of shifts for that kind of debrief period, and that doesn't exist. So that would have to become commonplace as well. I mean, an example of that would be when we did this in the Marine Corps, we wouldn't have, wouldn't be one shift gets off at 7 and the other one comes on at 7, and then we go our separate ways, which is pretty much what happened in the police department. We would have an hour or so overlap on both ends of that so that you were at work and you were able to discuss those things and go about your day and then debrief at the end. But that's not even built into the scheduling. So, yeah, I mean, it's part of that whole framework of shift that would have to occur.
I'm curious because there's a lot of what we've talked about over the course of these different episodes is ways in which at least certain aspects of the way the military does things, which I think, we're generally of the mind that it's more professional than what we've seen in our standard local police department, that they should maybe some of those practices should be moved over into this other setting. At the same time, there's always this concern about the over-militarization of police. I mean, do you think, to your mind, is the police need to be more militarized, but just with respect to specific things as opposed to just handing them weapons that they're not necessarily trained to use?
Well, I point more towards military members and not militarization. So that militarization is about equipment, not personnel. And so I am adamantly against military equipment and the militarization of police vehicles and tactics. It's about that kind of mentality, esprit de corps, focus on professionalism, that high level of training that generally comes from the military mindset. So while I say I would take in military officers and I would want them, that is also kind of a shortcut because what I'm doing there is just trying to steal that mentality. When it would be better for me to try and create that mentality right at home, but for a shortcut, I could steal that from the military.